Hi again then guys, and welcome to yet another installment of Rivals on Gran Turismo Sport, and this time we're pitting two ultra lightweight sports cars in a head-to-head match. These are cars which both have pretty hefty price tags. They're more in sports car or super sports car even territory. In some cases you're looking at even Nissan GTR kind of prices for cars with significantly smaller engines than you'd typically expect, a lot less power for instance, and even the performance on them, although really good, doesn't necessarily match up to what you might hope it would be for say 70 or 90 grand, depending on which one of the two it is. However, both cars in the world of a game don't matter quite as much as far as pricing, because of course it's not real money that you're talking about. So the question is, of these two cars, which are actually really well matched, the Alpine A110 in its newer form, and of course the Alfa Romeo 4C, which was already in the game from day one, which one is, strictly speaking, better in terms of its all-round package, its lap time potential, and of course we'll end off the video after the individual reviews, as we always do, with a top trump style matchup comparing the numbers of the cars to see which one is actually better. But let's get straight into it, first of all with the Alfa Romeo. Now, first things first with the Alfa 4C, this is a car which I've said before on the game, in specific videos even, it's a great little performance car. The 90 grand price is unfortunate, but it's an expensive car in the real world as well, so it's not too surprising. But what you get from the car is similar in a sense to stuff like the Suzuki GSX-R4 or the light car company Rocket, or a couple of others as well in the previous Gran Turismo titles, such as GT5 and 6, where there were these cars that didn't have ridiculously good numbers, but what they could do with the spec that they had was way beyond that. And that actually led them to be called by many people OP vehicles. The Dome Zero, for instance, is also in that same kind of category, as well as a couple of others too. And they deserve to be. They are, technically speaking, way too good for the kind of power band, the kind of PP level, the kind of weight that they are. And now that we have N category ratings, you could arguably say that that effect is even more so, because there are very few cars, apart from these two, that can actually genuinely keep up with them in those lower categories. Around, for instance, N200, both of these cars are a force to be reckoned with. Now, first of all, with the Alfa, the fact that it was already in the game gives it a huge advantage in terms of usability, because you could use it from day one, whereas the Alpine is a much more recent addition. I've always liked the Alfa in the game much more than real life. I'm not a huge fan of it, primarily because of the fact that it's really expensive for what it is. In the game though, as I said, that's not as much of an issue, because you can just pay out credits, get yourself a nice car, and again, it's super competitive. Now, neither of these cars are necessarily super beginner friendly. I have done a tune for the Alfa Romeo, doubtless I'll do one for the Alpine as well, but of the two, kind of ironically to me at least, I would say that the Alfa Romeo is probably more challenging when you first drive it of the two, and yet, here's the funny thing. Again, this is just for me, and I'm sure there are people who would feel differently, but the Alfa Romeo 4C, to me, feels easier to push hard than the Alpine does, which is kind of an interesting swap. At normal speeds where you're just cruising with the car, going quickly but not necessarily pushing it to the limit, the Alpine feels very easy to use, but when you push them to that limit, the Alfa Romeo feels much more at home. So with that in mind, let's consider the Alpine. Well, the Alpine, although, as I said, isn't necessarily quite as effective, you could say more so friendly, or as forgiving when pushed to its hardest, it is definitely the kind of car that is not to be overlooked. Personally, I much prefer the look of the Alpine of the two. Of course, that's down to personal preference. What's not down to preference, though, is that even in the game, it is cheaper by about 20 grand. And that's a pretty nice margin to have when you're talking about two cars that can both compete between N200 and N400. Of course, balance of performance notwithstanding. So career mode, for instance, you can use them, or in private lobbies, or even with balance of performance, potentially in, say, N3 or N400 even. Now, the Alpine is the kind of car which I think some people, maybe even myself included sometimes, could get a little bit frustrated with, because the way it handles, in a sense, is actually quite similar to the classic version, where it's very competitive and very quick, but it can sometimes have a tendency to be a little bit inconsistent, whereas the Alfa Romeo it never really surprises you. The 4C is quite a slippery little car, but you always know it's going to do that. It feels kind of like you're driving a little old-school Grand Prix machine, whereas the Alpine, on the other hand, it feels a little bit more like a small Porsche with that rear-engine, rear-wheel drive kind of vibe to it, where it's a little bit inconsistent. Sometimes it'll do one thing, sometimes it'll do something different depending on the undulation of the road, the kind of corner, the elevation change, and that can be a bit annoying. Now, as far as lap times go, you can see certain lap times in the video, but I actually got a better lap time with the Alpine than with the Alfa Romeo prior to this recording. But unfortunately, I wanted to get 2 laps worth of footage, and the second lap I messed up. So I got a great lap. It was actually a 2:12.133, which was quicker than the Alfa, but then I messed up, so I had to start again. However, it was still in the same kind of ballpark, just a little bit slower instead, with a .523 to the Alfa Romeo's .250. So they're both very close, very well matched. So all that remains, of course, is to actually see once and for all, how do the numbers compare? Well, as I said at the outset of the video, both vehicles can do a whole lot, given the relatively small spec that they're working with. Now, as with most of these rivals matches, I like to compare the cars in terms of their fully tuned potential. Not because that's necessarily the most applicable, but for 2 reasons. One, these are just for fun anyway, these videos of course, but secondly, it shows the ultimate range that the car can have for those who haven't bought it or can't afford the mileage points to upgrade everything, for instance, and you want to know which one has more potential. So, in the case of these, how do they square up? Well, first of all, of course, the point is definitely going to go to the Alpine. It's, as I said, about 20 grand cheaper, which gives it a significant enough advantage. As far as the categories, they can both span N200 to N400, so they're both exactly the same in that regard. They both, I believe, started in the same category as well. I think it was N300, if I recall correctly. As far as engine size, of course, biggest isn't always best. Rotary engines, as an example, go to show that. But on this occasion, as with our, well, pretty much all Rivals matches, we do give biggest best. Again, it's top trump style. So for that, we'll give the Alpine again the slight margin. They're both 1.8 litres though, so it wins by a fairly negligible amount really. As far as power, again, interestingly, the Alpine does win out, but by a much smaller amount. Only 2 horsepower separates the two. 370-ish horsepower for both cars is pretty good. That's a good level to be working with. As far as torque, though, interestingly, it swings completely the other way. The Alfa Romeo has a lot more. In fact, it has a lot more torque than it does power. 405 pound-feet to the 354 of the Alpine. As far as weight as well, the Alfa Romeo claws back another point with another huge advantage. In fact, this is potentially the biggest single advantage that the 4C has over the Alpine, and that is just how much lighter it is. 864 kilos is 106 kilos lighter than the Alpine. That's a massive advantage when both cars already weigh under a metric ton. And speaking of the ton and the power in relation to that, the horsepower per ton, not too surprisingly given the massive weight advantage, plus the fact that the Alpine only had 2 horsepower more anyway, well, it easily goes again to the Alfa Romeo with 428 horsepower per ton to the 384 of the Alpine. And as far as lap times go, as I said, I got different results driving the Alpine. First time was a 2:12.133 to the Alfa Romeo's 2:12.250, giving the Alpine the advantage, but then when I reran it again, the best I could get was a 2:12.523. So it swings either way, and again, we don't give them a point based on lap times anyway, it's always just a rough guide, and of course, depends on the driver, the tuning, certainly the track, it can swing either way on all occasions. So as far as points actually go, this is a tie. A very interesting occasion where the cars are actually that well matched that it literally is a standoff between the two. But as far as which ones get which points, Alpine has the significant advantage, maybe even the best advantage actually in terms of price. Being 70 grand, it's also got the bigger engine and more power. Plus, you could say a better lap, but again, no points for that. As far as the Alfa Romeo, on the other hand, it has the advantage for torque, which is an interesting one, weight, which is the best one for sure, and tied into that you could say the horsepower per tonne as well. And both of them of course tie in terms of the classes that you can use them in, N200, N300 and N400. So interesting overall just how similar both cars are, and they're both worth your time. I personally prefer the Alpine, but I think for performance and for winning races, I might actually go with the Alfa Romeo. The Alpine is my favourite for the looks and for the fun factor, but the Alfa Romeo just gets the job done, and the huge weight advantage is definitely a factor there. So overall, they're both worth a look, and they're both very nice alternatives to the other kinds of car in these categories. Sports cars, hot hatches, that kind of thing. So overall, that's it for this Rivals match. Of course, I'll see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.